What does it take for a starving man to refuse bread? In the bitter winter of 1862, as hunger gripped the streets of Manchester, thousands of workers made a choice that brought Abraham Lincoln to tears. It is a story that history almost forgot. A story of how the poorest people in England, living in absolute misery, held the fate of the American Civil War in their cold, calloused hands. To understand this incredible sacrifice, we must travel back to Manchester in its golden age. By the middle of the 19th century, this city was the industrial beating heart of the world. They called it Cottonopolis, the cotton capital of the globe. It was a chaotic, roaring, unstoppable metropolis. Day and night, the skies were black with the thick smoke of thousands of towering brick chimneys. Below, the cobblestone streets echoed with the iron rumble of heavy carts, and the air inside the giant mills vibrated with the deafening thunder of steam-powered looms. These factories ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, weaving textiles that clothed entire nations. The wealth generated here for the British Empire was unimaginable. Merchants became millionaires overnight, and British high society lived in unparalleled luxury. But beneath the immense wealth and industrial pride of Cottonopolis lay a dark, unspoken, and bloody truth. Manchester's golden pulse, its massive profits, and its global dominance relied entirely on a terrible shadow cast across the Atlantic Ocean. 80% of the raw cotton that fed these hungry British machines was harvested by the hands of millions of enslaved African Americans. They worked under the scorching sun of southern plantations, under the threat of the whip, enduring unspeakable horrors. This was the silent, dark alliance of the 19th century. British luxury and economic power were directly fueled by American chains. Every thread spun in Manchester carried the weight of human bondage. For decades, the world looked the other way. The profits were too high, the cotton was too cheap, and the machines kept turning. But the cosmic scales of justice were preparing to balance. In the spring of 1861, the American sky turned to fire. In April 1861, the American Civil War erupted. It was a brutal conflict that tore a nation apart. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln faced a desperate situation. To win the war and destroy the institution of slavery, he had to crush the economy of the Confederate South. Lincoln made a bold and dangerous strategic move. He declared a total naval blockade of all southern ports. Union warships patrolled the waters, stopping any vessel from entering or leaving the Confederacy. Lincoln intended to suffocate the slave-owning South, but in doing so, he accidentally severed the golden artery that kept Manchester alive. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The ships carrying raw cotton stopped arriving in the ports of Liverpool and Manchester. The warehouses emptied, and then, one by one, the giant steam engines of Manchester's mills fell silent. For the first time in generations, the thick, black smoke cleared from the sky. The sun shone down on the streets of Manchester, revealing a pale, cold winter sky. But this clean air did not bring joy to the people. It brought a terrifying, deafening, and suffocating silence. The heartbeat of the city had completely stopped. This was the beginning of the Lancashire Cotton Famine. By the winter of 1862, the crisis had tightened its icy grip on the working class. Over 300,000 mill workers were plunged into sudden, absolute, and desperate poverty. These were people who already lived on the absolute edge of survival. In the industrial slums of Manchester, many children never lived to see their 5th birthday, and those who survived rarely reached old age. Disease and exhaustion were already a daily routine. Now, without their weekly wages, they had nothing. The streets became ghost towns. Inside their tiny, damp, unheated rooms, families sat in the dark, shivering from the winter cold. They had no money for food, no money for coal. To survive, parents were forced to walk to the pawn shops, carrying their furniture, their heavy wool blankets, and eventually their most precious possessions, their wedding rings. All of this just to buy a single loaf of bread to keep their children alive for one more day. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the Confederate leaders in the American South watched the suffering of the British working class with cold, political calculation. This was exactly what they had planned for. They called it King Cotton diplomacy. The South believed that cotton was so vital to Europe that Great Britain would be forced to intervene in the Civil War. The Confederate politicians were convinced that the starving British workers would eventually riot, tear down their own cities, and force the British government to send the Royal Navy to break Lincoln's blockade. They expected Manchester to break under the pressure of hunger, beg for Southern cotton, and in doing so, officially recognize and legitimize the Confederate States and the system of slavery. The pressure on the workers was immense. Wealthy mill owners, politicians, and powerful newspapers began a sweeping propaganda campaign. They blamed Abraham Lincoln for the starvation of British children. They urged the working men to rise up, to protest against the Union, and to demand that Britain support the South so the factories could reopen. It was a massive trap. The workers were being offered a simple bribe. Trade your principles for bread, support slavery, and your suffering will end. The climax of this historic tension arrived on December 31st, 1862. On New Year's Eve, in the freezing cold, thousands of starving Manchester working men walked through the dark streets and packed into the Grand Free Trade Hall. The atmosphere inside was electric, heavy with tension and desperate anxiety. The wealthy elites took the stage, using powerful words to stir up anger against the American blockade.
Not the oppressive tariffs that starve his family. This injustice cannot stand.
They told the workers that their hunger was Lincoln's fault.
Down with the blockade!
They expected the crowd to roar in agreement. But as the speeches ended, a profound silence filled the hall. The starving men looked at each other. They looked past their own empty plates, their freezing homes, and their dying industry. And then, without hesitation, without a single dissenting voice, they made a choice that shocked the world. The workers of Manchester refused to be bribed by the blood of others. In that crowded, historic hall, they chose solidarity with millions of enslaved people they had never met, living thousands of miles away across a vast ocean.
Despite the hardship, despite the hunger, we stand for freedom!
They stood up and voted unanimously to support Abraham Lincoln and the total abolition of slavery. They passed a historic resolution, declaring that they would rather endure poverty, they would rather watch their factories rot, and they would rather starve than support a society built on the bondage and oppression of human beings. They wrote a powerful letter of solidarity and sent it directly to the White House. When that letter finally reached Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln read it, and he was deeply, profoundly moved. In the darkest hour of the American Civil War, when the European elites and aristocrats were turning against him, the poorest, hungriest workers of England had stood by his side. They had sacrificed their own livelihoods for the freedom of American slaves. In January 1863, President Lincoln wrote a personal, deeply emotional letter back to the working men of Manchester. In his reply, Lincoln thanked them from the bottom of his heart, calling their sacrifice an instance of sublime Christian heroism, which has not been surpassed in any age or in any country. But Lincoln did not just send words of gratitude. He knew these heroes were starving. The president organized a massive American relief effort. Ships filled with thousands of barrels of flour, meat, and essential provisions, paid for by grateful American citizens, were sent across the sea to the port of Liverpool. When the American ships arrived, the food was distributed to the families of Manchester. The people who chose principles over bread were fed by the very nation they helped to save. Today, if you walk through the modern, bustling center of Manchester, you will find a quiet, majestic square. And there, standing proudly against the sky, is a bronze statue of Abraham Lincoln. It is a permanent, beautiful monument to a moment in time, when everyday, forgotten people proved that human conscience is more powerful than economic empires. It stands as a reminder that even in our darkest, hungriest hours, our principles are the only thing no hunger, no empire, and no tyrant can ever take from us.